The movie opens up with a red-looking man named Hellboy, and has two horns on his head and a moving train. He heard a sound and immediately asked the lady, Joe, if she heard it too, but she said no. Junior G-Man called him Big Red and made fun of him for being scared. He then went ahead to sit beside Joe. Hellboy asked him why he came for the ride, and he replied that he just wanted to ensure Joe and the thing in the box got to Fairfield without any trouble. Hellboy goes into the carriage where the thing is, while Junior G-Man asks Joe about what is in the box. She said it was a funnel web spider and explained how demonic this particular spider was. The spider broke out of the box and attacked them. It was a very huge spider. Junior G-Man shot it several times, but it ended up killing him. The carriage they were in rolled into the forest, and they fell out of it. Hellboy asked Joe to lay still for a second. He stood up and looked for the spider, which chased him for a while. He ran and then started fighting it, but the spider began shrinking. Hellboy tried catching it, but it went into a ventilation shaft. Joe sat on a root flare, feeling frustrated and sad. Hellboy walked up to her and said, "There is something in these hills, trees, the dirt, something haunted, evil. This place has a stink." Joe said she only smelled pine needles. He replied, "Underneath that, Joe, madness, death. Dark things call to dark things." Joe said they were screwed and that she needed to find a phone. She grabbed her bag, and they both left. They went to an old house where a woman standing at the front mentioned seeing Hellboy in a magazine. Joe introduced herself and said they'd been in an accident and asked if the woman had a phone. The woman said yes and invited them inside. They saw a boy lying on the floor. The woman said he was witched because he kept teasing Cora Fisher, a witch, by throwing rocks at her window and leaving dead things for her to find. Tom Farrell entered as soon as he heard Cora Fisher's name. The woman was surprised to see him. He found a witch ball at the doorstep and handed it to Hellboy. After a while, they all went outside. Tom said he would be going up to Cora's place, but first he wanted to visit his mother. They told him his mother had been dead for a long time. He asked about his father. As he was about to leave, Joe asked him about Cora and if they could follow him. Hellboy pulled her to the side and told her he was taking her back to headquarters. She refused, saying she needed to understand what was happening for real, not from some weird old books. They both followed Tom. A witch gave instructions on how to make witch balls. Tom, Joe, and Hellboy arrived at Cora's house. Tom called out her name, but there was no response. They entered her house, and Tom found a witch ball and an insect in a jar. Joe went up to Cora's room and called out to Tom and Hellboy. They found her skin. Tom said she must be roaming around, and they just had to wait for her. They sat waiting. Hellboy talked about his mom, saying she was a witch. He had never met her and never wanted to. Everything he knew about witches, he wished he didn't. Tom shared how he met the devil and got the bone. Cora returned to her room in the form of an animal and entered back into her skin. She choked and screamed. Joe couldn't believe her eyes and went downstairs, followed by Hellboy. Tom comforted Cora. They both went to the heater, and she sat on the floor, telling Tom she didn't know what to do. She married Nate Southby, but he died, and their babies died too. She was all alone. Tom tried to calm her, but she said they wanted her soul, and they would get it. Suddenly, the door opened, and the insect in the jar fell and broke. Hellboy went outside and saw Effie Kolb, a witch on a horse. Tom came out too, and she said she was there for unfinished business with Tom. He said he knew. Hellboy told her she should go through him first. She replied that her master wasn't afraid of him and gave Tom a present, the horse, which was his father. Tom realized it was his father and shouted, "Curse you, Effie Kolb." She flew off laughing. Tom approached the horse, and it turned into his father. The old man spoke for a while before dying. Tom cried and asked Cora if Reverend Watts was still at the little church up on the side of the mountain. She said yes, but told him he couldn't go up there because the crooked man was waiting for him. Tom said that might be why he came back, to settle things with that old devil. But first, he would bury his father on that church's ground. An insect landed on Cora's leg, making her weak. She fell to the ground. Joe tried to hold her, but the insect flew away and landed on a tree trunk near Hellboy, who squashed it. The next morning, they began their journey up the mountain. Tom was carrying his father's body, discussing with Hellboy. Joe and Cora were talking about witch magic. Suddenly, Cora went missing, and they started looking for her. Hellboy found her hanging in the air. A snake came out of her body, entered her mouth continuously, and then bit her neck. Cora screamed. Hellboy dragged the snake to the ground and began fighting it. Cora woke up and tried to stop him, but he threw her down. The snake bit Hellboy again. He dragged the snake and cut off its neck before falling to the ground. In his sleep, Hellboy saw his mom. Cora told him about his mother's whereabouts. He saw how his mom was pregnant with him, and then woke up. Tom tried to revive Cora with a lucky bone, but she died. They reached the church and met the Reverend, a blind old man. Tom told him he was going to the hill where the devil's house was. The Reverend advised him to go while the sun was still up because the devil's power was strongest in the dark. Tom replied that the sun was still shining, but the Reverend asked if he was sure. Suddenly, it became dark. Joe was surprised and remarked that wasn't how the earth worked. Witches surrounded the church. The Reverend and Joe began to pray. Meanwhile, Tom heard Effie Kolb calling his name, taunting him to come out and face her. The church shook, and Joe asked the Reverend if the witches were running under the church. He replied that they were everywhere and explained how a coal mine collapsed about 30 years ago, killing 100 men. He said the ground last shook like this then. Joe realized that Tom was no longer in the church. Tom was outside, talking to Effie Kolb, who was sitting on a tree, laughing out loud. The devil himself, Mr. Onselm, arrived, cracking his neck and saying he had come to collect his lucky bone. Tom agreed to give it to him but made him promise that no harm would come to the people inside the church. The old devil responded that it was Tom who had put them in harm's way. As Tom was about to hand over the lucky bone, Hellboy arrived and stopped him, saying he didn't like the deal. The fact that the devil wanted it so badly made him not want the devil to have it. Hellboy told Tom to go back inside. Mr. Onselm tried to convince Hellboy, saying he had the power to ease his mother's pain and let her soul ascend. Hellboy, intrigued, asked if he would really do that. Mr. Onselm confirmed, saying it would only require something small. Hellboy just needed to twist off Tom Farrell's head and bring it to him. Hellboy, realizing the devil was renegotiating, shot him, but the devil dodged and began using his powers to throw sharp iron arrows at Hellboy. Joe helped drag Hellboy back inside the church. Hellboy removed the arrows and asked Joe to help pull the rest out. Meanwhile, Mr. Onselm started making another deal, this time with the Reverend. He offered to buy the lucky bone from him, but the Reverend shouted, "There is nothing in here for sale." The devil tried to convince him by restoring his eyesight and making him young again. But the Reverend fell to his knees, declaring, "No, sir. I come fairly by my years and afflictions, and I don't want nothing else." An old witch noticed the tomb of Abby Riley, who had poisoned 2 husbands, and asked Mr. Onselm how she was planted in consecrated ground. Mr. Onselm replied, "So many sinners on this consecrated ground." He and the other witches knelt, touching the ground, chanting, "Flesh rots, but the sin goes on." Inside the church, things became quiet for a moment, but then a coffin broke through the door. The dead body inside came out and spoke to the Reverend, taunting him about his affection for pretty girls during Sunday sermons. The Reverend rebuked her, but she grabbed his face, asking him to kiss her like he always wanted to. Hellboy intervened, smashing her head to the ground. Outside, Mr. Onselm began calling out the names of the dead, waking them up to attack the people inside the church. The dead stormed the church. Hellboy shot them one by one. Tom's dead father rose up and tried to strangle him, but Tom hit him with a shovel, knocking him down. The Reverend knelt and prayed, asking God to take away the eyesight the devil had restored, declaring he wanted no gifts from the devil. His eyesight faded, and he returned to his old self, thanking the Lord. While Hellboy continued fighting the risen bodies, the Reverend held the cat bone with Tom Farrell and called upon the Holy Spirit to fill the lucky bone. A bright light shone from the bone, and the Reverend made the sign of the cross on the shovel with it. Hellboy took the shovel, waved it in front of the bodies, and they fell to the ground. He then ran outside and struck Mr. Onselm with the shovel, causing daylight to break through. Tom told Hellboy that Mr. Onselm was going back home. Joe didn't want Tom to leave, but he insisted on going. He told her to stay with the Reverend, and if they didn't come back, she should keep going down the mountain until she found a telephone. Tom and Hellboy made their way to the devil's house. Inside, Joe asked the Reverend why they had built a church on top of a collapsed coal mine. The Reverend supposed they thought it was a doorway between this world and the other, and that consecrating the soil would block the doorway. Joe remarked that maybe it wasn't such a great idea. The Reverend agreed, saying it worked fine until today. He insisted on bringing the shovel, thinking it might still hold some holiness. Though Joe didn't want him to go, he was determined. As they walked, Tom found some old pictures that scared him, and he threw them away. Hellboy saw some dolls on the ground, kicked one, and heard a baby cry. He entered a room where he thought the baby was, with Tom following behind. However, it wasn't Tom. It was the devil playing tricks on Hellboy's mind. Joe and the Reverend descended into the coal mine. The Reverend noticed Joe was scared and wished her friends were with her. She remarked that Hellboy wasn't afraid of anything. The Reverend, however, told her that Hellboy was afraid of something, telling her how he really felt about her. Suddenly, birds attacked the Reverend, and before he died, he told Joe, "Magic comes from the spirit, not from the flesh." Hellboy entered a room, and the door shut behind him. There he saw his mother. Meanwhile, Tom was quietly walking when Effie Kolb grabbed him from the wall. He defeated her with the lucky bone. Joe encountered a huge spider and began reciting magical words from her childhood. The spider fell to the ground, and she also collapsed weak. After a while, she woke up to find the spider small again. She trapped it in a jar and began running. Hellboy and Tom go down a set of stairs, and Hellboy tells Tom to wait. Hellboy lit up the paper on the ground and saw Mr. Onselm. The devil began chasing Hellboy, who fired shots at him. Mr. Onselm used his powers to throw Hellboy across the room, pinning him to the ground and filling his mouth with insects, trying to kill him. Tom called the devil, distracting him. Tom then threw Cora fissures which ball into the devil's mouth, causing him to lose his powers. Hellboy stood up, threw Mr. Onselm down the stairs, and shot him, turning the devil into coins. Hellboy and Tom saw Effie Kolb on the hills. She lamented, "All of a sudden, I'm old. I don't know how to be old." Hellboy and Tom returned to the church. Hellboy rushed inside, calling out Joe's name. He found her lying on the floor and woke her up. She sat up and showed him the spider she had caught. As Hellboy and Joe began their journey back, they saw a telephone. They were picked up by a helicopter, with Joe resting her head on Hellboy's shoulder. The movie ended with a horse standing on the mountain near the church, bearing the message, "Beware, I am a witch." Kindly subscribe for more if you enjoy recaps like this. Goodbye and thanks for watching.